Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Adult Ed Speaker Series for Beth this evening. We have the great privilege of having Ria David and Mark Perlin, our speakers this evening, to speak about DNA and the Jewish question. Without further ado, I want to just introduce our speakers. Their topic tonight, DNA can find the guilty and free the innocent. Cybergenetics resolves evidence that crime labs can't. Restoring justice through science, Jewish values can transcend bureaucratic indifference, making the world a better place. Through criminal cases, this talk explores Judaism and DNA justice. The background of our speakers, we have Mark Perlin, who's the Chief Scientific and Executive Officer of Cybergenetics. He has 20 years' experience developing computer methods for information-rich interpretation of DNA evidence and providing TrueAllele products and services to the criminal justice community. Dr. Perlin has testified about objective computer DNA evidence in state, federal, military, and foreign courts. He holds doctoral degrees in mathematics and computer science and a medical degree as well. Ria David is a co-founder and president of Cybergenetics. She earned her PhD from Carnegie Mellon from the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. Her research focused on business culture and American history. Dr. David's research has been augmented by having lived in 4 countries on 3 continents, and she has a working knowledge of 5 languages. She has been involved in business in all of the countries where she's lived. Her specialty is integration and cultural change in the business environment. Dr. David has an executive MBA from the Katz School of Business at the University of Pittsburgh. Welcome, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Shelley. Thank you very much for inviting us and giving us this opportunity to speak to you. Thank you for the Adult Education Speaker Series. We enjoy doing these kinds of presentations because very often we're dealing with a lot of scientific terminology and concepts, and this gives us an opportunity to sort of spread the word, talk about the science and what we do to a different kind of audience. Just a little bit of background about cybergenetics and how it came to be. Mark was in the computer science department at CMU, and I was in the history department at CMU. We were married, and he was doing research in automated processes and started working on things like the Human Genome Project. In 1994, we decided to start the company part-time, and the work he was doing on the Human Genome Project was essentially taking huge data sets and interpreting them very quickly using automated processes. Actually, using this process, he was able to map chromosome 11 for the first time. In 1999, we were approached by the British government and asked if we could adapt our technology for forensics. And it never occurred to us to do this at all, but we thought it was an interesting project and we started doing that and formed the company Cybergenetics. Well, the company Cybergenetics was formed in 1994 when we were doing work on the human genome areas. So some of the things that Cybergenetics does is it's a company that has products, we do services, and we essentially work in the criminal justice environment at this point. We get DNA from crime scenes. I don't know, anybody here watch CSI? Okay. So we get DNA from crime scenes. We're not actually in a lab, we're purely computer science. But after the DNA, the crime scene, after they pick up the schmutz from the crime scene, it goes through some technologies in the lab. The data gets extracted, the DNA gets extracted, and what you get at the end is an electronic signal. And what we do is we take that electronic signal into our computer technology, and we're able to interpret it. Interpretation means we're able to put identification information, DNA identification information, to these signals. So every person has their own DNA profile, their own DNA identification, and we can use that and we can interpret that. We've been at this now for quite some time, obviously since 1994, and we've worked on a lot of these generations. Mark will be talking about some of that. We've done more than 500 cases, and there are a number of labs in the States that actually use our technology. And we were sort of always flying under the radar. And for the first time last year, somehow we started to get some awards for some of the work we did. These are some of the awards we had, most of them in Pittsburgh, and one of them from Atlanta. So what exactly is this TrueAllele automation? As I said, you get the DNA information coming from the crime labs, or coming from the instruments from the labs. That's an electronic signal. That gets fed in through the interface and then moves to a server where you have the ability to parallel process. What does that mean? It means we have lots of computer servers sitting in a room in our office in Oakland. I think we're up to 100 processors, roughly 100 processors, which means that essentially if we wanted to, we could get rid of the backlog of a lot of the DNA cases that you read about in the news. So a huge amount of parallel processing work. So data gets fed in, technology works, it separates out the DNA into its individual DNA identification components, each person's DNA gets matched either to other pieces of evidence or to reference samples, cheek swabs people send in, and then we'll go to court or testify. Some groups will actually use and run their own TrueAllele processes. So as I said, in 1999 we were approached by the Forensic Science Service of the United Kingdom, and they wanted to know, could we adapt the technology we were using for things like the Human Genome Project to forensics. We never really heard of forensics. We didn't know what we knew about forensics, but we didn't know what the problems were. The problem in forensic at that point was that groups were starting to try to create databases. The FBI, for example, has a big database of convicted offenders. When somebody commits a crime, take a cheek swab, the DNA goes into this database, and they can search and match and see if they can match criminals through their DNA from crime scenes to people who are already on this database. Well, the FSS was at the head of this. The British government was in the vanguard of this technology and this approach. And they came to us and said, we've got this backlog, can you help us? We said yes. We created the technology specifically for them, solved the problem, and essentially eliminated the backlog of 350,000 items over an 18-month period. Based on that same technology, that same automation of being able to process a lot of data and look at very complex samples, we worked on the victim remains from the World Trade Center. We had a database that was routinely chunking through about 18,000 samples. So we were able to do that. Essentially what we were being asked to do, remember I said you get a cheek swab, you've got a database, you try and you match it. There weren't any cheek swabs. You had the victim remains, very, very difficult pieces of DNA evidence. So we were essentially taking the victim remains, the pieces of DNA from whatever they could find. There was also DNA from the missing people themselves. So they would, for example, go to someone's house and try and get a toothbrush or a hairbrush, anything that would help give a DNA profile, DNA identification for that person. And then also DNA from their family members. And so the goal over there was to match the victim remains through their own DNA from home or from whatever place you could get it, and their family members, and slowly start to identify them. And so we did that as a service, and quite successfully too. So that's a little bit about the story, that's a little bit about the history. As I said, we started in 1994. We came out of the Human Genome Project. We were asked to move into forensics, and since about 2000, we've been primarily in forensics, doing cases for groups and helping other groups to come on board with our technology.
Thank you, Beth. So we started doing cases, and this is the first case we ever did. That was the dentist who was killed in Indiana Township by a state trooper. It's got an amazing backstory. The state trooper was living with the estranged wife of the dentist. The divorce papers that were unsigned, splattered with the blood of the victim. There's been TV shows, books written about it, all kinds of things. But from our perspective, the most important thing was that the only major physical piece of evidence was DNA under the victim's fingernails. And this was something that the FBI was able to produce a match statistic of 13,000 to, whatever that means, since there were more like 13 million people in Pennsylvania. the question was, could you get more information from the same data? This wasn't even 7% of what was under the fingernails, because what it was a mixture of the victim, 93%, and an unknown person, who was another 7%. The computer was able to pull out that genetic type of the unknown person, make a comparison, and get a match statistic of 189 billion from the same data. We went to court. There's always an opportunity to challenge DNA evidence as reliable. We passed that reliability test. The defendant was convicted. He's serving a life sentence. And ultimately, based on this case, this precedent in the state of Pennsylvania for our technology as reliable science. Then we got involved with more groups. There were some policy changes in Washington that you'll hear briefly about that around 2010 that led to most DNA mixture evidence, a combination of 2 or more people, being withdrawn from crime labs from criminal justice. And one state, Virginia, contacted us and asked if we could sort of be an extension of their crime lab and process all of these cases that they couldn't. So we processed over 100 cases. We wrote over 70 reports. Ultimately, the lab brought the technology in-house. This was one of the interesting cases. This is Michael Gardner, lawyer in Washington, D.C. He's accused of molesting 2 young girls at his daughter's slumber party, ages 9 and 10. And there was DNA on the underwear of the girls as well as on some pajamas. And the crime lab, using its usual methods, couldn't say very much. On the same identical evidence, the computer could separate out these mixtures, come up with a match statistic of 20 quadrillion. And as the Washington Post said, 2 girls accusing a prominent lawyer who's the wife of the mayor of a major town, that's nothing. But you add DNA, and now that's evidence. He was sentenced to 22 years in prison. I won't go into all the strange things that happened afterwards, but I think he's ensconced there now. This is closer to home. This is the Wolfe sisters. And in this homicide, these sisters lived in Friendship in the city. They had come to the city from Iowa. One was a psychiatrist, the other one worked at Hillel in Squirrel Hill. And they were murdered in their home. And whoever killed them left a huge trail of evidence of DNA as they went. Whoever the killer was, he was just shedding clothing and leaving DNA. There was just a lot of DNA everywhere. And ultimately, their next-door neighbor, Alan Wade, was accused of the crime. And across these 15 to 20 items of evidence, our crime lab couldn't interpret any of the major evidence. I think later on they could look at something under the fingernails, but initially they could say nothing. So Cybergenetics was asked to re-examine the same data objectively by computer. And we found things like Susan Wolfe's right-hand fingernails were connected to Alan Wade with a 6 trillion statistic, as opposed to nothing, inconclusive. There was a sock that was used to drive a car that was connected to both the defendant and the victim. There was a hat left at a burglary a few weeks before the murder. This is interesting because that hat had not been analyzed by the lab, and it actually contained Alan Wade's DNA with enough information to produce like a 65,000 match statistic. And you can imagine that if crime labs were running properly and evidence was being analyzed, he could have been found as a convicted felon, and the murders might never have happened. So that's the impact of crime labs saying, I don't know, I don't want to use computers, I'd rather say nothing. What's a DNA mixture? A mixture occurs when you have different individuals contributing their DNA, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If you have a handgun, you might have 5 people on it. A doorknob may have 7 or 8 people who've all left their DNA in small quantities. And the task is, after you've mixed the DNA in the real world, how do you unmix it? Well, what a crime lab does is they do go through several procedures, which I'll talk about later. But they also then have data signals. And the starting point for their analysis or for a computer is to separate out genetic types called genotypes from these data signals. This is what a data signal looks like. This is a mixture. I won't go into all the details. It's late. You've had food. I'm just going to briefly describe. But each person has 2 parents, right? And children and grandchildren, mazel tov. And imagine that you have DNA at one genetic location. Scientists will analyze 15 to 20 from different chromosomes at the same time. And one person leaves a lot of DNA that produces a lot of signal, tall peaks. Another person contributes less DNA, and that produces lower peaks. These peaks often overlap. They're hard for people to examine. Computers can use all of this data. They can look at the heights, the patterns, the variation. What people have done for 20 years is they just get rid of it, because boy, that's a lot easier. And what's ever left is either present, or what's ever gone is absent. And there's no pattern, there's no quantity, there's nothing. There's no way to really analyze serious data. And with low-level data, the peaks, the data are all underneath this arbitrary human-chosen threshold, and it's all thrown out, which is why most evidence that's mixtures is called inconclusive by crime labs. There was an inkling almost at the beginning that these statistics were unreliable. This is a famous study done by the Department of Commerce, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. If you want to ask me about them later, I'm happy to answer questions. They do very well by showing that there are problems and then indicating there are no solutions. But that's our federal government. So back in 2005, they did a study which caused a lot of hysteria in the community, never published, but people have looked at the data. And on the same simple 2-person mixture that they sent out to about 70 laboratories, most labs said they couldn't say anything at all. It's inconclusive. And the ones that produced a match statistic gave numbers ranging from 4 zeros after the 1, like 10,000, 1 followed by 4 zeros, up to 14 zeros after the 1, in the hundreds of trillions. It was all over the map. Most people try to say as little as possible, but you have to ask, does this technology make any sense for human interpretation, discarding data, and then either saying nothing or giving something that ranges over 10 orders of magnitude? Just the number could be anything. NIST did another study where they showed that it kept going, but at this point there were 100 labs that responded. There was somebody who they asked the labs to test against, who wasn't there. 70 labs said he was there. That's normal practice in crime labs. 6 labs actually properly, out of 100, properly excluded the individual. Actually, one of them was in South Carolina using their new TrueAllele system at the time, because computers can do this, even though people may falsely incriminate you. Mixture statistics shut down crime labs. Once people realized what was going on, the FBI came out with new standards in 2010, and those methods didn't work either very well, but labs had to go back and recalculate their statistics. Suddenly lawyers, prosecutors, and defenders were seeing numbers that had been 10 million were now 6. And statistics went away completely, politicians panicked, crime labs shut down. I think 2 weeks ago, a lab in Southern California was shut down. Same panic. The labs don't want to say that everything they've done has been wrong, according to science, so instead there's a scandal, things shut down, and then they bring in some other method that doesn't work very well. The DC lab was shut down largely so the FBI could take it over a year later. That's a whole other book that somebody could write. And in Texas, a bunch of labs were shut down, and it was recognized that there were 25,000 cases that needed to be reanalyzed. And actually, in an amazing paper published in a scientific journal that contained no data, but just another proposal from the FBI and people who would get contracts to analyze it, they began reanalyzing those data, producing more meaningless numbers. So I actually had a lot of data from different validation studies we had done in crime labs. And I started off as a question, why is it that the match statistic was always 1 million? Either they got no answer or it was 1 million. It's a measure of information. It's the strength of evidence. 1 million means that the chance of a match between the evidence and a person is 1 million times more than a coincidence. Basically, a match statistic is a ratio of two numbers. The chance of a match between evidence and a person divided by the chance that that match was actually a coincidence. And so 1,000,000 is where juries believe you and where the validation studies show errors don't happen. What this paper showed was that the main method used by crime labs and the FBI for the last 15 years is a random number generator that has nothing to do with information and is completely useless. What it actually shows is when a laboratory scientist at a crime lab subjectively determines that these 8 locations match and they're not going to use the other 8. Get to that in a second. That for every 2 tests they consider, you get another 0. So if you consider 8 tests, 2 plus 2, you get 4 zeros. If you have 12 tests, you get 6 zeros, or 1,000,000, which explained why you always were getting 1,000,000, because there were 13 locations that were used. So basically, most of the evidence used to convict people is fine, but the match statistics are totally bogus. Also, these methods can't acquit anybody. They're a one-sided statistic. They're very popular with certain law enforcement agencies. You're not going to get a number less than 1. It'll be 1 or bigger, and sometimes a lab will report a number of 13, and that's very small. And people have been convicted on that. Ideally, you'd want an unbiased DNA workflow. Those of you who know scientists, practice science, you know that you want to enter all the data into a computer, have the computer not think about what the data is, but just calculate a statistic, and when it's done, the math decides, is it a big number, a small number? That's it. That's science, right? Keep people out of the process and use robust, valid software. That isn't what happens in most crime labs. Instead, there's a biased DNA workflow that almost all programs use, and it's mainly because the software doesn't work. So to make the software work, you need experts whose jobs depend on choosing software that doesn't work. So you need lots of government workers to be experts at choosing data because they're experts. So instead what they do is they choose their data. I've been involved in cases where a slight data choice is the difference between an exclusion or a match statistic of 10 million on very low data and very subjective software. If you choose the data right, you might be able to get a different answer. Who would agree with that? Right. Okay. So you choose your data. Now, believe it or not, then the expert decides, is he guilty or not? Oh, not guilty. Is he in or not in? Only if they decide the person's in do they put the limited data into a computer to calculate a statistic based on the manipulated data. And if it doesn't agree, the lab protocols say, do it again differently until it agrees with you, because you're the expert. The person dominates. That's the latest methods. Of course, this puts people back into the process because the software is bogus and it introduces human bias. TrueAllele, which is our system, is not like that because we didn't know anything about forensics when we started. You know, I came out of Carnegie Mellon and other backgrounds, and the concept was, well, of course you use all the data. Of course there's no people involved. You put data into a machine, then it objectively analyzes it to death with 100 variables. You're all done. It produces an answer. You test the thing for 10 years. And when you're done, you know you have a validated objective program. This is not that popular with crime labs. 10 labs actually we have the 8th U.S. lab just went live with the state of Georgia. There are some labs that are a little more sophisticated and like the notion of accuracy and objectivity. There have been a lot of studies. There have been 34 validation studies, usually done with collaborators, sometimes by independently by the labs. 7 of them published in peer-reviewed journals. The workflow eliminates bias. We've had, at this point, at least 15 challenges when someone asks, is this valid science? And then we go to court and we provide 4 feet of binders of studies. It's not usually done on the DVD. It's about 4 gigs worth of stuff. But sometimes they print everything out. We show the studies and why it satisfies the states and or Supreme Court's rules for reliable science. What is reliable science in a court? It's supposed to be testable, have an error rate that's been determined, have some peer review, and be generally, or doesn't have to be and, be generally accepted. The concept in the 1990s is that psychoanalysis would not satisfy this. What's the error rate? How do you know when you're wrong? So it's that kind of thing. We're trying to get rid of subjective science. It's very transparent. On this DVD, we give this huge DVD with everything. We give lectures, math disclosures. We give an invitation to let people test the software for free if they're a defendant. Because the source code nonsense that was just ridiculous in the media, we have told crime lab, we've told defenders who will come up with any excuse to keep good evidence out, that's their job, there's nothing bad about that, that you have the source code under confidentiality, and we knew what would happen. At the next hearing, this was last fall, the defender argued they desperately needed the source code, they found out they could have it, and it changed to, we don't like the terms of the confidentiality agreement, Your Honor, it's outrageous. Of course, he'd never seen the agreement, because in order to not lie in court, he had to not see the agreement. But he could imagine what such an agreement would look like. So lawyers argue. That's not news. But we try to give everything you could possibly imagine, including the opportunity to test. And the method can give a big number or a small number. It doesn't care if someone's there or not. It doesn't share these biases. So here's a typical result from a typical crime lab. Actually, I think it's Allegheny County. It says here's a textured swab from a handgun. There's no information, no conclusions can be reached. There's 4 people, 4 or more contributors, and so they couldn't do anything with it. This was an interesting case. Over time, I've gotten to know almost everybody involved, prosecutor, defender, police. So imagine there's a handgun, and the usual result is, I don't know, and then it's not used, and then lawyers go to court, and they argue, and totally random things can happen in court. But what happened in this case is the lab generated data, sent us the data, we unmixed the mixtures into the genetic types of the 4 different contributors. One person had a match for the statistics in the hundreds of thousands, which was quite reliable, and he pled guilty. Somebody else, who was also at the same crime scene and also accused, was completely excluded from the gun, and they dropped charges. That's what you would hope happens in society. That almost never happens. This is a talk on Jewish values, so here's one. From Deuteronomy, you shall appoint magistrates and police officers, and they shall govern the people with due justice, which you might loosely interpret is just interpret the DNA already and use it to help adjudicate cases. Arrest the right people, let the wrong people go, and so on. That's a Jewish value. In Allegheny County, we've been involved in over 60 cases. We've testified over a dozen times, mainly for the prosecution, sometimes for the defense, and there have been acquittals and exonerations based on the DNA that we've analyzed as well, when before there was no information. The usual outcome in a case when it's this decision and it's guilty is a guilty plea. And a guilty plea means that the DNA is back in the case, and that combined with other evidence means it's not worth continuing. There are the people who view everything as evil in the criminal justice system and all people being innocent, but typically the innocent people are innocent, and there's a lot of DNA evidence showing otherwise. You might not be. TrueAllele is provided both as a product to crime labs, there are about a dozen labs that have it, and also as a service. We've done over 500 cases, mainly in the US, lots in Pennsylvania. Here's a case that I was going to leisurely go through, but I'll go through it quickly, because it's a typical high-profile case where 2013 there was a serial rapist in Bakersfield, which is just about 2 hours north of Los Angeles, California. With serial crime, there were 3 crime scenes. There was evidence found at each scene. What these crimes were was somebody would case these apartments of women, typically, not always, but typically people who worked as domestics, where there wasn't a man in the house, and they had children, young children. And they got their thrill, whoever was doing it got their thrills by going in, threatening everyone, sometimes molesting the children, and then tying up and raping the mother. And he was doing this quite regularly, and it was horrific, to the point where the local gangs were helping the police, because it was just over the top. And so this is the kind of evidence that was found. There are DNA stains left at the second crime scene on clothing. The perpetrator would use a lot of duct tape, zip ties, and then wash the victims up afterwards. So DNA was found on a bathtub faucet. This became a critical piece of evidence. It was a zip tie found in the road. What happened is that in the middle of the rape, he had collected all cell phones from the children, and one of the kids, who's about 10, 11 years old, held on to a cell phone. It didn't look like a cell phone. And she managed to call the police. I'm not going to go through this. We don't have time. I've played this at conferences. It was given to me by the prosecutor's office. And it's a different perspective on crime. We're used to hearing about innocent people and so on. This is a girl calling the police, calling 911, describing that her mother's being attacked. And then the perpetrator hears she's making the phone call and comes after her. She escaped to a neighbor's house, and then he was spooked by this, ran away, and dropped a zip tie. Now that zip tie in the road had so much of his DNA that he could be identified. But the other 30, see, there you go. He is identified, Billy Ray Johnson from the database said. But it's perfectly legal to drop a zip tie with your DNA on it in the road, even if it's outside of the crime scene. The question is, what does this have to do with the crime? The Kern County lab, which had acquired TrueAllele, but wasn't really online at that time, which is why you're asked to get involved, looked at these roughly 36 items of evidence, 37 cuttings, and swabs from clothing, blankets, surfaces, skin, body cavities, telephones, zip ties. Most of them were mixtures containing 3 or 4 people, and they couldn't analyze it yet, not until they had their TrueAllele technology on board. And this is an example of what these match statistics are. So there were 8 items of evidence across 3 different crime scenes. There are different blocks. Those were the 3 items we saw from scene 1, 3 from scene 2. This is comparisons to different people, and Billy Ray Johnson lights up 8 of the items across 3 different crime scenes. For the zip tie, we see there's 20 zeros after the 1. That was why they were able to analyze it using simple methods. But there's also a match statistic with over 4 zeros in the tens of thousands to somebody who is the victim of the crime. So now that zip tie just isn't something they found him, it's something that connects him to the crime. So what TrueAllele did is it made all of those comparisons visible, and when the crime lab came on board, they independently ran their own system, got the same answers, we both testified at trial, and he was convicted. We did one case for Israel. We don't know what happened, but they sent us DNA. Officers were patrolling in the Jordan Valley. They stopped to help somebody who pretended to have a flat tire, and that led to point-blank shooting and a murder of the officers. And we looked at a 3-person mixture on the car jack handle, and we found a match to that person. I don't know what happened afterwards. I'll go through this quickly, but this is a fairly dramatic story. So imagine 1989, on a cold Indiana highway, there's a team of 5 gang members who are terrorizing the highways in northern Indiana. They are bumping into cars, motorist pulls over, they check for damage, and then they rob them. And then they rob them on another crime and beat them up. And then they rob them and they beat them, they rape them. And it's just escalating with these 5 men. So the police are really anxious to get someone. And through an amazing coincidence, what these men had done is they had broken into somebody's car. The car had 3 men in it coming home from work. The car broke down. Their work uniforms were in the car. As they went off to get help and motor oil, the actual criminals broke into the car, stole their work uniforms, and when they committed this gang rape of all 5 men raping this motorist who stopped, they left the work uniforms from the innocent people at the crime scene. Through that was a lead, and 5 men at the factory were arrested. 3 went on trial. 2 were convicted, 1 sentenced to 65 years, Darryl Pinkins, and Roosevelt Glenn was sentenced to 35 years because they were connected through their work uniforms. Interestingly, the crimes continued. There were dozens more attacks, and the police said they were just copycat. So they actually never caught the people who were doing this. So in 2001, the wrongful conviction clinic in Indiana, Bloomington, took a look at evidence, got 2 items retested, the victim's jacket, the victim's sweater, and they found DNA evidence. And this was amazing. They found 2 contributors who weren't the accused, and they thought that this was fine. But the post-conviction court said, wait a second, there were 5 perpetrators, and 3 people went on trial, and you've got 2 unknown people. That completely explains it, and so they stayed in jail. Which probably wouldn't happen today, but that's what happened 15 years ago. Here's DNA on a jacket. The crime lab could separate out the victim's non-sperm DNA, and then there was a mixture of 2 people in the sperm fraction, the male DNA. They could get the easy major DNA, the person who was 90% of the mixture, but the minor part was invisible to them. But the computer could do that. In the sweater, the same thing happened. They could pull out the major 80% of the unknown assailant, but they couldn't get the minor. In fact, from their methods, they don't even see them in the data. So they stayed in jail. Roosevelt Glenn, when he went to trial, another hair was found and analyzed. It didn't connect to him, but that was another piece of DNA. And so what happened in the end was that TrueAllele, the computer, was able to do things that crime labs can't. Crime labs can try to compare evidence with a person, but they can't compare evidence with evidence to get a match statistic. The computer can. It can also calculate exclusionary match statistic. It's not somebody's opinion they're not there. The computer's saying it's 1 in a quadrillion. They're not there. They're just not there statistically. It could reveal 5% minor contributors, which are invisible to human review, and what were needed. It could look at different evidence items together to get more information, looking at the jacket and the sweater together. This is normal science, but in forensics, that tends to not be done. And then, at the suggestion of Professor Fran Watson, the lawyer, she asked the question, are these DNA profiles related? And we showed that 3 of the perpetrators from their DNA genetically were brothers. There was no relationship between the workers in the factory. And so we found 5 unidentified genotypes. The defendants were not linked to the crime. And about 2 years ago, with the intervention of 48 hours, this show has been shown a lot of times, guilty until proven innocent. TrueAllele is mentioned very briefly, and that's complex, but TrueAllele is what got them out of jail. Darryl Pinkins was released. That's his son, who was unborn when he went into jail. He's 24 years old in that photo. Another person, the co-defendant, who'd been released, usually served half a sentence. If you good behavior, he'd been in jail for 17 years, was Roosevelt Glenn. Rhea and I met Roosevelt Glenn for the first time in November. There was a conference that we hosted through our Justice Through Science nonprofit. It was a full-day conference. It had everybody, very unusual for a continuing legal education program. Prosecutors, defenders, innocents, police, judge, scientists. Usually you just go to your own group, and it was actually hard to keep fights from breaking out. But we contained over 200 people attended, both physically and virtually. And Roosevelt gave a phenomenal keynote talk. And one of the things he pointed out was that his mother had died that summer, and he had been exonerated maybe 6 months before. And what he said was, his mother died knowing that his name had been cleared through DNA. So justice is a major Jewish value, Deuteronomy again. Here's the Hebrew for those who like that. In English, justice, justice shall you pursue. And certainly getting innocent people out of jail with evidence that crime labs cannot interpret achieves justice. Allegheny County actually purchased our system under Cyril Wecht 10 years ago. And then they had a change of middle management, and they haven't used the system. Which is why we still get cases every year. And there was an article in the Post-Gazette after we gave a CLE, and the DA's office said that everybody's fine with creating a local database to catch criminals and exonerate innocent, and that was 4 years ago, and there's been no interest on the part of the crime line. Other counties that have TrueAllele do that around the country, but not ours. Rhea and I started a nonprofit about a year ago, Justice Through Science. Its mission statement is bringing better science into criminal justice through forensic education and public service. It's a 501c3 for those of you who have checkbooks handy, or just keep it in mind. Probably missed the deadline anyway, given the change in tax law. That's the website, and this was the full day program that we put on in the courthouse, sponsored by the judges, bringing modern DNA evidence into the courtroom as a continuing legal education. And the Jewish values that we all share in English from Pirkei Avot is that the world rests on three things: on justice, on peace, and on truth. And I think those are Jewish values through the work that we do in cybergenetics and otherwise we bring into forensic science. Thank you very much.